This is the part 2 video for the belt pouch digital leather pattern by Raven Wright Studio. If you haven't already seen part 1, I recommend going back to that and following those instructions before you come to this part. But if you finish part 1, this is where you continue. This is assembly step 6, where I'm going to demonstrate a dyeing technique. You can dye your leather however you like, but I'm going to teach you how to do an oil diluted dye. So you take a little bit of leather dye. I recommend about 5 milliliters or less. You can do between 2 and 5 milliliters. And then you're going to measure out the rest of 50 milliliters with neatsfoot oil. And neatsfoot oil is a particular product specifically for softening leather, and it can be used as a dye as well. So it will condition and dye your leather at the same time. And this can help you get a smooth effect when dyeing leather, and it takes a little bit less effort than using lamb's wool brushes to try and get a nice smooth effect. So one thing you'll notice is I didn't pick a big enough jar, and I overfilled it a little bit. So you want to make sure that you get a jar that's big enough. I'm going to put the lid on so that I can shake it. And that will help mix up the pigment inside the oil. And this will give you a light tone. So I'm using a light brown dye and neatsfoot oil, and that will give you a much lighter color than if you had applied the dye straight directly to the leather. So now we get a clean rag. I like to use a clean cotton rag. Make sure that it's well mixed, and I am going to make a mess. And that's why I've got down brown paper, and underneath the brown paper I have an absorbent pad. It's the kind of pad that you train a puppy on, if you're interested, and that really helps soak up messes when you're doing leather dye. I've also got a popsicle stick so that I can stir a little more. We just really want to make sure that that dye and oil are well mixed. Now we simply dip the rag into the oil and dye, and we start spreading it on. And while you're doing this, you might see lots of streaks and lots of splotches and think, what in the world have I done? This is a mess. This was a terrible idea. But it will get better. So by using the oil pulls the dye through the leather. So you can see that I've even kind of created a drip streak there. Once it's done, and once the oil has soaked in overnight, for example, for several hours, almost all the blotches and streaks go away. It does give you a little bit of a rough, kind of rustic look, but it is much smoother than when it initially appears as it goes on. And that's because the leather holds on to those dye particles and pulls them through the leather as it soaks in. And so I'm actually going to dye every surface using the leather and the oil. And because of the way the oil soaks into the leather, you can't actually over dye it because the leather will only take so much oil. So once you reach a certain darkness in color, you really can't get it any darker because it won't take any more oil and you just wipe it off. So that's one of the advantages of this technique is you can't over dye. So I could have made this a little bit lighter if I'd put a little bit less of the leather dye in. You can look at some of the pictures at the end of this video and you'll see that there's an example of a pouch that looks a little bit lighter in color, and I used the exact same technique. I just used about half the amount of dye in the oil, and it made it kind of a lighter yellow color. And this one will come out kind of a saddle tan orange brown color. So because we dried out the leather a bit using the water as we wet formed it, I want to get the oils back into the leather. And I want to do it on all sides, even on the interior flesh sides. So there are different techniques. You don't have to follow this technique for dyeing. You could actually dye the pieces beforehand if you want to, if you're using a different technique, and then assemble them. But this is just one way, because we're wet forming it. It helps restore the oils in the leather and keeps the dye color fairly consistent. If you dye before you wet form it, it could make the dye run and appear blotchy because you've wetted the leather. So I'm just being very thorough and going over it several times. As I mentioned, once you get enough of the neat's foot oil into the leather, you really can't make it much darker because it'll only soak up a certain amount. So there is a measure of safety in doing it that way. And I'm just going to apply it a little bit more to make sure that I've got the maximum amount of oil that it will soak up. Okay, I'm about done here. I have gone over it several times, and it's soaked up quite a bit of oil. And now it's important to let it wait for several hours, preferably overnight if you've got the time. So you can see it's got a little bit of a rustic look, but it's smoothed out quite a bit. It isn't nearly so blotchy. So this is assembly step 7, and the next thing we're going to do is to sand down the edges. So we've got 3 layers of leather, and depending on how well you cut and how well you sewed, they may not be perfectly even. But if you take some heavy grit sandpaper and sand them, you could also use a Dremel with a sanding wheel, and you can sand them down and make them nice and smooth. And we're going to clean them up. And then after we've sanded them, then we can go ahead and burnish them. So we're just trying to level out each of the 3 layers. Make a nice smooth edge. It's a fairly thick edge, so we want to make it look nice and clean. And it can make a little bit of a mess. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to demonstrate is how to burn a lamb's wool dauber. So lamb's wool daubers are a little too fuzzy for the next step. So I'm demonstrating how to burn it and prepare it to dye the edges. So this is from a different time than when I made a different pouch. So you can see this is the lighter color. It doesn't quite match of what I had been doing. This is the lighter colored pouch that I made. So you burn it, and then you kind of brush off the burnt ends. And I'm going to just take my straight leather dye, and I like to just use the cap to put it in. You can use it however you like, but I use the cap, and I'm using my lamb's wool dauber, and I'm going to just go over the edges. In this particular case, I already have the hardware on. In the one that I'm demonstrating the majority of this video, I do not have the hardware on. I put that on very last, and that will be demonstrated at the very end. And so we have those raw edges now that no longer have color on them. So I'm just using the dye to color those edges. If you really wanted to, you could also do the oil dye, but I like the accent of the darker 100% dye put on the edges. And the reason we burned the fuzziness off of this lamb's wool dauber was so that you have more control and it's not quite so wild and fuzzy. So once again, dyeing is optional. You could have left your leather pouch a natural color if you chose to. And instead of dyeing the edges, you could just skip to the next step and burnish them. Okay, so the next step is to burnish your edges. I like to use this Japanese leather burnishing product called Tokonol. If you're using veg tan leather, you can actually just use water, and there's also some other products that you can use. But I find Tokonol to be a good product, and it works well in burnishing edges. And one of the advantages of Tokonol is that not only does it work on veg tan, it also works on other types of leather, oil and chrome tan. Not quite as well as veg tan, but you can burnish just about anything with it, which is unique. Other burnishing products only work on veg tan leather like this. So I'm just applying a small, gentle coat on all of the edges. I prefer to use my finger with nitrile gloves on. That way I don't get my fingers messy. And we're going to burnish all the raw edges. This is my wood burnishing tool. And to burnish, you just go over it. You don't want to push down very hard. You mostly just want to go back and forth. Because if you push down, you can kind of get a mushroom edge to a certain extent. So you want to go back and forth several times. And using Tokonol speeds up the process. It goes pretty fast. But it does take some repetition. It can also smooth down a flesh side. So this is a flesh side, and if you have a rough flesh side, this one isn't terribly rough, but it's a little rough. Using toconol, you spread it around, and using a glass burnishing tool, you can just push it down in, and it makes a much flatter surface and keeps any leather dust from coming off of a flesh side. So once that's done, you just want to wipe off any excess um, burnishing compound. And you might even want to use a little bit of water. Because it's been oiled and stained already, a little bit of water won't hurt it. It'll just clean the surface. We just want to get any excess off so it doesn't cause any spotting or streaks. And then dry it immediately with a fresh cotton cloth. The burnishing is complete. Now, the edges are still a little damp, and I recommend letting them dry before you go to the next step. So once it's all dry, the next step is to put on your sealer of your choice. And the sealer I chose, you apply with a damp sponge. It's called EcoFlow Super Sheen. There's lots of different sealers out there, and you don't necessarily need to put one on if you don't want to. I just prefer to do that because it helps seal in the oils and keep any additional moisture or dirt out, especially if this is going to be an outdoor pouch that you use when you're outdoors and on a hike or roughing it. This can help keep the leather from getting too saturated or dirty. So I'm going to seal all the surfaces, the edges, the inside, the outside. And it does make the surface a little damp. I'm going to just demonstrate the first coat. I usually do 2 coats. The second coat you need quite a bit less because it's already sealed once and it will shed a lot more. So you do it again and apply quite a bit less. I do it inside and outside. Now let that dry completely. Assembly step 9 will be to attach hardware. And as I said before, you can put on any hardware you like. But I'm going to demonstrate putting on something called a tuck clasp or a tuck lock clasp. And so I have a mark in the center so I can line that up. That's from the pattern. And I just use an awl to mark where I want to put the holes. And I'm using my smallest little punch here. It's just a diamond punch, actually, that I'm using to make the holes for this tuck clasp. It has little prongs that go in. You push the prongs in and try not to throw it all on the ground. I had another one right there. So we all struggle. I know a lot of people edit out all these kinds of things, but you can see that even the designer doesn't know exactly what he's doing and make it perfect. So what I discovered, I needed to do a test fit first before I put the locking piece in. So this is the top locking piece. And you get those little prongs in. And then I'm using a little rivet setter to push them over. Just the back end of a rivet setter. And then you click it in the latch at the bottom and use the prongs on that to make a mark. And then you say, what do you do? How do I punch it if it's already sewn up? Well, you need to have a little scrap of wood. I've got a little scrap of wood here. Stick it inside. And I'm using a straight punch that corresponds to the size of the prongs of the holder. So I'm going to punch those slits. You put that in the front, make sure that it fits, and this metal piece goes in the back, and that helps hold it on. So you put that inside in the back, and obviously you can't see inside the pouch, but I'm bending the prongs over with the metal tool, just like I demonstrated on the top closure piece. And so there you can kind of see it's got the metal piece on the inside. And so that metal piece, depending on what you put inside, could scratch things. So I have a thin piece of leather that I cut out a round circle, and I put glue on it, and I'm going to attach it right there over the inside, so that if I put something on the inside of that pouch, it won't get scratched, because those metal pieces have some sharp edges and could scratch things. Just using a little bit of water-soluble leather glue and a little brush. And you want to apply the glue to the flesh side. That makes things adhere best, and it's the stickiest. So I'm going to stick that in inside over the closure attachment that goes on the inside. You really can't see me doing it because it's on the inside of the pouch. But I'll hold it up here and you can see kind of what it looks like. So it goes over that closure on the inside, and it will protect your items. So you do need to let that dry before you use it. But now that is complete. Here are some examples of completed pouches. Different angles to give you an idea of what it looks like. There's the 3 different sizes. There's 3 of the same size. There's what they might look like with objects inside of them. And then there's me with them on my belt.